Enter deeply into the sky. Keep on gazing till you become one with it. Continue to gaze till you become one with the sky. Relax into the vastness of the sky and become one with it.
Sounds True presents Essential Listening from the Alan Watts Archives. We begin with Do You Do It or Does It Do You? Session 1 with author, philosopher, and self-proclaimed spiritual entertainer, Alan Watts.
I wonder if it's ever struck you how curious a thing it is that most of the things that we experience, we regard as things that happen to us, which we ourselves do not originate, which are events expressing some sort of power or activity that is external to ourselves. And if you consider that, you realize that what you mean by yourself is rather narrowly circumscribed. Even events that go on in our own bodies are put in the category of things that happen to us in the same way as things that go on in the world outside our skins. If there's a thunderstorm or an earthquake, well, it happens to you. You're not responsible for it. But so in the same way, when you have hiccups, you didn't plan on it. If you have belly rumbles, you had no intention of doing it. And as to the catastrophic act of getting born, well, you had nothing to do with that. And you can spend all your life blaming your parents for putting you in the situation in which you find yourself. And this way of looking at the world in this sort of passive mood as something that happens to you goes right down to our general feeling about life. It goes down to the way in which, as Westerners, we have been accustomed to look at human existence as a precarious event in the cosmos that, on the whole, is depicted as being completely unsympathetic and alien to our existence. In other words, if you're reared with a 20th century, or shall we say an early 20th century common sense, which is based on the philosophy of science of the 19th century, with its rejection of Christianity and Judaism, you regard yourself as an accident, biological accident, in a stupid universe, which is mechanical, but has no feelings, no finer feelings. A vast, pointless gyration of radioactive rocks and gas in which you happen to occur. Of course, if you don't have that point of view and you are more traditional, you look upon yourself as a child of God, and therefore under authority. In other words, there's a big boss on top of all this, who allowed you, at his pleasure, to deign to have the disgusting effrontery to exist. And you better watch your P's and Q's, because that Almighty is looking after you, with the attitude of this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. And when you look at the world in that image, or in the other image that it's a stupid mechanism, either point of view you take, you don't really belong. You're not really part of all this. And I could use a stronger word than part, only we don't have it in English. We have to say something like connected with it, essential to it, or to put it in the strongest possible way, it is quite alien to Western thought to conceive that the external world, which is defined as something that happens to you, and your body itself as something that you get caught up with, it is quite alien to our thought to consider all that as you yourself. Because you see, we have such a myopic view of what oneself is. It's as if, in other words, we selected how much experience is really to be regarded as me. As if you focused your attention on certain restricted areas of the whole panorama of things that you experience, and say, I will take sides with that much of it. Now, we come here right at the start to an extremely important principle, which is the different points of view you get when you change your level of magnification. That is to say, you can look at something with a microscope and see it a certain way. You can look at it with the naked eye and see it in a certain way. You look at it with a telescope and you see it in another way. Now, which level of magnification is the correct one? Well, obviously, they're all correct. They're just different points of view. You can, for example, look at a newspaper photograph under a magnifying glass, and where with the naked eye you will see a human face, with the magnifying glass you will just see a profusion of dots, rather meaninglessly scattered. But as you stand away from that connection of dots, which all seem to be separate and apart from each other, they suddenly arrange themselves into a pattern. And you see that these individual dots add up to some kind of sense. Now you'll see at once from this illustration that maybe you, when you take a myopic view of yourself, as most of us do, but you may add up to some kind of sense that is not apparent to you in your ordinary consciousness. When we examine our bloodstreams under a microscope, we see there's one hell of a fight going on. All sorts of microorganisms are chewing each other up. And if we got overly fascinated with our view of our own bloodstreams in the microscope, we should start taking sides, which would be fatal, because the health of our organism depends on the continuance of this battle. What is, in other words, conflict at one level of magnification is harmony at a higher level. Now, could it possibly be, therefore, that we, with all our problems, conflicts, neuroses, sicknesses, political outrages, wars, tortures, and everything that goes on in human life, are a state of conflict which can be seen in a larger perspective as a situation of harmony? Well, it is claimed, you see, that some human beings have broken through to that vision, that they've slipped somehow or other into states of consciousness where they see the apparent disintegration and disorganization of everyday life as the functioning of a totality which at its level is completely harmonious. And you can say, aha, at last I see, I got the point. I've seen how all this makes sense. But what this insight depended upon was your overcoming the illusion that space separates things. That is to say, the space, the interval between your body and mine, the interval created by birth at one end and death at the other, and then after somebody's death, then somebody else's birth. These are events with intervals between them. And normally we regard these intervals in time, these intervals in space, as having no importance, no function. We tend to see the universe itself as really consisting in all the stars and galaxies. That's what it is. That's what we notice. But the space in which all this happens is sort of written off as something that isn't really there. But what one has to realize is that the space is an essential function of the things in the space. After all, you can't have separate stars unless there is a space around. Eliminate the space and you will see you couldn't have this phenomenon at all. And vice versa. You couldn't have the space They wouldn't be there in any sense whatsoever if there weren't the bodies in it. So the bodies in the space and the space are two aspects of a single continuum. They're related together in exactly the same way as a back and a front. And you just don't get one without the other. So the moment you see that intervals, that space is connective, you can understand at once how you are not just to be exclusively defined as a flash of consciousness that occurs between two eternal darknesses, which is the popular common sense view which Western man has of his own life. That you consider that in the darkness that comes before your birth, there was no you, and in the eternal darkness that follows your death, there is likewise no you. And I'm going to discuss these matters not by appealing to any special spooky knowledge, as if I had been traveling on the higher planes and knew all my previous incarnations and therefore could tell you authoritatively that you are much more than this individuality. I'm going to do it on a basis of complete common sense, that everybody has access to the facts. And that just what you have to realize is that life is a pattern of immense complexity. And what you call yourself as a living organism, say, I am my whole body at the very least. Now, what is that body? That body is recognizable, and I recognize my friends when I meet them again, with luck, and you recognize me. Although the last time any of you saw me, I was absolutely something entirely different from what I am now. Just as the flame of a candle is never a constant. The flame of a candle is a stream of hot gas. Only you say the flame of the candle as if it were a constant. Well, it is a recognizably constant pattern. The spear-shaped outline of the flame and its coloration is a constant pattern. But in exactly the same way, we are all constant patterns. And that's all we are. The only thing constant about us at all is the doing rather than the being. It's the way we behave, the way we dance. Only there's no we that dances. There's just the dancing. Just as the flame is the streaming of hot gas, just as a whirlpool in a river is a whirling of streaming water. There is no thing that whirlpools. There is the whirlpool. And in the same way, each one of us is a very, very delightfully complex undulation of the energy of the whole universe. Only by our process of miseducation, we've been deprived of the knowledge of that fact. Not as if there was someone to blame for this, because it's always with our own tacit consent. Because life is basically a game of hide and seek. Because life is pulsation, on and off. Here it is, and now it isn't. And by being this pulsation, we know it's there. See, you don't know what you mean by on unless you know what you mean by off. That's why when we want to awaken someone, we knock at the door. Not enough to slam the door once with your fist and make a big noise, but you keep up a pulsation, because that by its on and offness attracts attention. All life, you see, is this flickering in and out. Only there are enormous rhythms in it. There are very fast flickering ins and outs, like the reaction of light upon our eyes, such that if I take a lighted cigarette in the dark and I spin it, you will see a circle of fire. Because the reflection of that cigarette tip on your retina lasts, it endures. Just in the same way as on a radar screen. An image stays a little while until it's revivified by another round. So in that way, you see, you notice continuity. And in the same way then, you notice the continuity of a light Because although, like say, with an arc lamp is actually a flickering light. And that's why they don't allow arc lights to be used in any shop where there's a circular saw moving. Because sometimes the flickering speed of the arc light so synchronizes with the turning speed of the teeth on the blade that the teeth look as if they're not moving. And so anybody who might put his hand on the blade would have it chopped off thinking it was a still one. So in this way, very fast impulses are looked upon as constant. And we see where there are fast impulses a solid thing. When you look at the blade of a propeller or an electric fan, the separated 4 or 3 blades become a solid disc, and you cannot throw an egg through it. Well, so in exactly the same way, you can't put your finger through a rock, because the rock is moving too fast for your finger to go through. That's the meaning of the whole phenomenon of hardness. Hardness in nature is immense energy, but acting in a very concentrated space, restricted space, but going to beat hell. That's why you can't get through it. Now, from those very tiny fast rhythms, which give us the impression of continuity, there are also in this universe immensely slow rhythms. And these are very difficult for us to keep track of. And they impress us and depress us as our own life and death, as our coming and going, which goes for what is, to us, such a slow pace that we can't possibly believe that it is really a rhythm. We think of it as our birth, as something quite unique that could never occur again, because we're so close to it, you see, and it's moving so slowly. And so with that point of view, we are, like Marshall McLuhan said, he borrowed a metaphor from me, which is that we are driving a car looking at the rear vision mirror. That means that the environment in which you believe yourself to exist is always a past one. It isn't the one you're actually in. The process of growth, the basic process of biology, is one in which lower orders are always being superseded by higher orders. But the lower order can never figure out, or only very rarely figure out, what the higher order is that's taking over. And they see it as a terrible threat, as total disaster, as the very end. But therefore can never be aware that the principle of growth always has and always will continue. Because that's what's going on. But you never know what the next step is going to be. Because if you did know, you wouldn't take it. Because it would already be past. Do you understand this? That any certainly known future is an event of which we can say, you've had it. And in that sense, it's past. When we play games, and we say in chess or in bridge or whatever game you're playing, the outcome of the game becomes certain. We at that point cancel the game and begin a new one. Because the whole zest of the thing, which takes me back to the idea that this whole thing is a hide and seek game, is that you don't know what the next order coming up is. But one thing you can be sure of, it will be an order, and it will comprehend you. At the moment, we stand at a time in history where we're beginning to think of a great countdown on the end of the human race. Terrifying possibility that through atomic energy, we may obliterate this planet and turn the whole globe into a star. Maybe that's the way all the stars started. Imagine, you know, this great thing coming up. The countdown on the end. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Where have you heard that before? You sit on the seashore. hear the waves going in and out. And you don't stop to think. That's what you're doing. That's what the whole business is doing. The places where the wave mounts and mounts, it gets too big for its boots or whatever, and it spills and breaks. We can do this stuff. But very important to realize that that's what you're doing. And you don't get panicky. The person who can press that button. So if you realize that's what it is, it doesn't really matter if the whole thing is. Then there's a chance that it won't do it. That's the only chance we have. Not to do this thing which attracts us like a kind of vertigo, like a person who looks over a precipice and is all set to throw himself over. Or a person who jumps out of a plane when they're skydiving and forgets to pull the parachute ring because he gets fascinated with a target. It's called target fascination. He just goes straight at it, you see. So we can get absolutely fascinated with disaster, with doom. All the news in the newspapers is invariably bad news. There is no good news in the newspapers. People wouldn't buy a newspaper.
What's for loneliness, loneliness being
Even
a
the free
trifle.
press is full of terrible news. Except the San Francisco Oracle. And the fascination, you see, for this doom
I will
might be
place my...
neutralized if we would say,
Oh,
well,
I what of Liam, cutting off displeasure
Why bother about
from
that?
thy foe, with the darkness is
it's
the
just
fountain of
another
existence.
fluctuation in this huge, marvelous, endless chain of our own selves
The
and our
one
own
who
energy
lives
going on.
mindfully sent.
See, here's the problem. Because of our myopia, because of the way we've, as it were, restricted consciousness to focus upon just that certain little area of experience that we call voluntary action. That's us. And everything else happens to us. Now, that's obviously absurd. Let's suppose you take in your hand one of those toys, a gyroscopic top. And you suddenly notice, the minute you get this in your hand, that it has a kind of vitality to it. It seems to resist you. It starts pushing you in a certain way, see? And sometimes you're with it, and following it. And then sometimes you see it. It's just as if you held a living animal in your hand. You know, you pick up a hamster, or a guinea pig. You hold this little thing in your hand, it's always trying to escape. So the gyroscope always seems to be trying to escape your hold. Now, in exactly the same way, what you're experiencing all the time, all sorts of things are getting out of control and doing things you don't expect. It's trying to escape your hold. Right, then don't grab it. And you discover that this living thing that you're feeling, like the gyroscope top, it's alive. Because you can see very simply that you would not understand the experience that you call voluntary action or decision, being in control and being yourself, unless in opposition to that, there was something else. You couldn't realize self and control and will unless there was something other, out of control, and instead of will, won't. It's the two together only that produces the sensation that we call having a personal identity. Only there is a funny thing about human consciousness which has been worked out very carefully in the facts of that. It is that our attention is captured by the figure rather than the background, by the relatively enclosed area rather than the diffuse area, and by something moving rather than what is relatively still. And to all those phenomena that in this way attract our attention, we attribute a higher degree of reality than the ones we don't know. That's only because, for the moment, those are more important. Consciousness is a window that is scanning the environment from top to top, just in the same way as a ship's window is looking for rocks on the ship. And the radar just tells us we ought to pay attention to. And so in this way, we have this rather myopic way of looking at things. And we screen out from attention anything that is not immediately involved to the scanning system's basic sensory interaction. But quite obviously, you as a complete individual are much more than the scanning system. You are in relationships with the external world that on the whole are incredibly harmonious. Going back to this illustration of every living body as something like the flame of a candle. The energies of life in the form of temperature, light, air, and food, and so on, are streaming through you all at this moment in the most magnificently harmonious way. And you're, all of you, far more beautiful than any candle flame. Just sitting in these chairs, just going. You know? Only we're so used to it. We say about that, so what? Show me something interesting. Because it's a characteristic of consciousness that it ignores stimuli that are constant. When anything is constant, it says, okay, that's safe, it's in the bag. You need to pay attention to that. Therefore, we eliminate systematically from our awareness all the noise things that are all the time. And instead, they become focused on the opposite things that might happen to us. Which is all right, but we make too much of it. And we make so much of it that we identify our very selves, I, ego, with the radar, with the troubleshooter. And that's only tiny fragments of one's total being. So that if you do become aware that you are not simply that scanning mechanism, but you are your complete organism, then very swiftly, in turn, as a consequence of that, you become aware that your organism is not the way you think about it when you look at it from the standpoint of conscious attention, from the standpoint of the ego. From the standpoint of the ego, your organism is your organism, which is the world. But from a physical point of view, your organism is again like the candle flame or the oil flame. It is something which is a continuous pattern of activity. The key idea here is practice. Let's suppose I'm a and there's one section where everything is really next section is quiet. Next section is still. Next section is noise. And so on. And you try not to listen. Just recognize where you are. And try by putting your finger in your mouth, you can move away a little away. Now, as this not traveling is first of all made in the head, it's then made conscious, then made clear, connected to the mind, and so on. But the not keeps going on. That is interpreted pattern, continuous as it is material. You might be an vegetarian, you might be a vegetarian, and you might be a meat eater, and so on. You know your constitution changes all the time, but your friends still recognize it, because you're still putting on the same show, the same pattern. That is the recognizable individual. But we are trained in our language, the very structure of the language we talk deceives us into misunderstanding this. Because when we see a pattern, we ask, what's it made of? Like you see a table. Is it made of wood or is it made of aluminum? But then when you inquire into what is wood, and how does wood differ from aluminum, The only thing a scientist can tell you is the different patterns, that is to say, the different molecular structure of the two things. And a molecular structure is not a description of what something is made of. It is a description of what dance it is performing, what motions, what kind of a symphony this is. Because basically, all phenomena of life are musical. And gold differs from lead in exactly the same way that a waltz differs from That is a deception we get into because we have two parts of speech in our grammar. We have nouns and verbs. And verbs are supposed to describe the activities of nouns. And this is simply a convention of speech. You could have a language with only verbs in it. You don't need any nouns, or you could also have a language with the nouns only and no verbs. And it would perfectly adequately describe what's going on in the world. So if you were used to speaking with a language that had one part of speech, you could say just as much as we can with two, and be a lot clearer. Only at first it would sound awkward, but you'd soon get used to it. And then when you got used to it, it would be a matter of common sense that the patterning of the world is not some kind of stuff that's patterning. You don't have to seek for a substance underlying the whole thing, it's just patterning. And we're all that. And so in this way, there is, to a person who really wakes up, you very soon realize that your existence is not something that is just the hopeless little creature that's suddenly confronted with a great big external world that goes at him, and eats him up. Every tiniest little thing that comes into being, every minute little fruit fly or gnat or bacterium, I will go so far as to say is an event upon which this whole cosmos depends. This thing goes both ways. It's not only that every little organism which exists depends on its total environment. The reverse is also true, that the total environment depends on each and every one of those little organisms. So that you could say this universe consists of an arrangement of pattern in which every event is essential to the whole thing. Now, we screen that idea out of our consciousness in exactly the same way that we screen out the perception of space as an important reality. Just as we pay attention to the figure and ignore the background, so we see one way of looking at things, namely that the organism is very frail against the environment. It lasts a long time, the environment, but the organism only lasts a short time. What do you mean the environment lasts a long time? What does the environment consist of? Just a lot of little things. And yet there is the environment just as the same way as there is the face in the newspaper photograph behind all those little dots. When you get far enough away from it, you see the face. When you get far enough away from all the organisms and the little bits of things, you see the environment in another scale of magnification. But actually, the whole thing is arranged in a polar system where the enormous depends on the tiny and the tiny depends on the enormous. And you get a relationship between these extremes, which can be called a transaction. That is to say, a transaction known as buying and selling. It's impossible to have buying without selling and selling without buying. So you always, wherever you are looking at the general panorama of sensory experience, try switching. Try shifting your attention to all the things you thought were unimportant, to the constants, to the background, and begin looking at the spaces between people. All painters have to learn this, because especially if you're working in oils, you actually have to paint in the background. Weavers know this, Because when they're making patterns and weaving, they've got to weave the background as well. Or if you do needlepoint with embroidery, think of the hours you spend putting in the background over the canvas in wool. And you become aware of it. Same way the people who made the great Oriental carpets. They're much more aware of the background as constituting an essential part of the total experience. So as you become aware of this, you see the same thing that you notice in music, namely that it is only as a result of hearing the interval between tones that you hear any melody. If you don't hear the interval, you're tone deaf, and all notes are the same noise. All you hear is rhythm. You don't hear anything else. You've got to hear the interval. So then watch the intervals between people. The things that aren't said, the things that are tacit, the things that are implicit rather than explicit. And then you begin to get connected. Now it's very important to have a connection. This is the way it fundamentally comes out. Of seeing the thing you forgot. You know, you can always bug people in a beautiful way, in a very helpful way, by just saying to them, what did you forget? Well, I don't know. What was I supposed to remember? Well, I'm really not trying to put you on. I mean, it's not difficult. This is something completely obvious that you forgot. You'd easily remember it because it's so obvious. Well, that's the hardest thing in the world to think of. What's the most obvious thing you forgot? What's that? Well, who do you think you are? Well, how do you answer that question? Who are you? Well, you give a name. You say, I'm Joe Dokes, I'm Alan Watts. That's not true. That's what people told you. They put that name on you, and they taught you to identify with it and to behave as it was expected to behave. But that's not who you are. You know very well. Go back in your memory. Go back into your infancy before they started telling you this. Who are you? And if you get with that, you know very well. Are the old ancient of days. Only it is a conspiracy that you mustn't let on. Because everybody knows. And if one person realizes it, the others are a little bit offended. They say, well, how come you're so great? We work it in Christianity by very cleverly. Allowing this one individual to be recognized. Nobody else, therefore, to be. But since he had been safely crucified, he struck the heaven. He didn't bother singing. So everybody, therefore, who gets an attention and never comes out with it, will piss themselves. They say, who the hell do you think you are? You Jesus Christ? Heard you say Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ, in which the individual is simply involved in something that happens. This thing that happens. always something other than you. You don't recognize it as an integral part of your own being, without which you cannot know what you mean by the word I. But in the truth of the matter is, though, that if you will face it out, every single one of us knows that that isn't true. There is as it were, a recess of the soul, of the psyche, where everybody knows perfectly well that you are not just this irresponsible little mouse that's been chucked down into this world, but that you are really doing this work. You're running it. Only you can't admit it, just in the same way as you can't admit that you're responsible for the way your own heart beats. You say, oh, that's not my doing. I have no control over my heart. Do you have any control over being conscious? Do you know how you will? You say, I intend to take my hand down from my face and put it on the earth. I can do that, but I don't know how the hell it's done. So what we mean by the capacity of voluntary control in the ordinary sense of the word is that we don't understand it at all. So you might say, in a funny backwards way, that the only kind of control you really understand is that where you're not using your will.
I will place my mesh
So
on it.
easy, like you open and close your hand. You know how to do it? Sure you know how to do it. But you can't put it into words and explain it to someone.
Has roots that go deep.
Say, well, come on, aren't you human? Don't you know how to open and close your hand? Just do it, silly.
I will place my linger
We
is.
don't realize it.
I will place my mishkan, my mashkan, literally mine. A parable. One person loved another and said, my love for you so hot. Linger is Asia, Africa glow. A whole world distant, ebbs and almost gone. Lives a romantic forest. Lingam of air. Suddenly encountering, behold, a woman, do not wed her. Who is bold, restrain weak folly, bold melancholy. It is the sun of life and light, shining through the 12 tribes of heaven, and spreading the power through the tree of life, to make all things new. And I am prince of darkness, as well as king of light. Shall there be anything wherein I, the Lord of all, have no dominion?
Therefore, you keep on doing it.
They see crooked.
Because if you
Is it
didn't
not
surprise
written in
yourself,
Exodus that the Lord hardened the heart
it's
of
just the very
Pharaoh, and
fact
again in
that you
Isaiah,
seem to be
I
the victim of
create
the thing you
both
don't
the evil
understand,
and the
and that you
good.
seem to conclude your life every
Not
time
also
in a wipeout
the
called death,
innermost self of man is the jewel of
where
eternity,
all
or
your
the
control
magical stone
goes.
of the wise, which gives its
It's
possessor
just
the
exactly
priceless
that
boon of
opposite
immortality.
condition
He who
to
truly
what you
knows
call
the
being
self was.
alive
This thy
that
body is the
allows you to
palace
be
of the
alive.
king. This thy body is
And
the
every time it
manifested
happens, it's like it's
world
new.
of God and
Like every
man.
time you're
This
born,
thy
it seems
body
like
is
it's
the
the only time.
seamless robe of Adonai. Apart from me, there is neither wisdom nor knowledge nor understanding.
But of
Into
course,
every
right?
state of knowledge do I enter, into false knowledge as well as into true, so that I am not less the
When
ignorance of the
Hindus and Buddhists
meditation on Aleph. I am
use the
without
word
beginning,
karma,
without end, older than night or day,
the
younger than
basic
a
meaning
babe
of it is
newborn,
action.
brighter than light,
From
darker
the
than
Sanskrit
darkness,
root,
beyond all things and
to,
creatures, yet
to
fixed
do.
in the heart of everyone. A seeker
And
concentrating
therefore there
on
is some
mindfulness
error
advances like a
in
fire
the common
consuming the
translation
chains
of
of
karma
bondage
as a
both
law
great and small. A
of
monk or
cause and
lay
effect
person having
or
developed a
cosmic
high degree
retribution.
of mindfulness, rejoice in mindfulness,
As a man
delighting in
sows,
the
so
domain of the
also
noble
shall he reap.
ones. These awakened ones,
Has a
dedicated.
Western
On
flavor,
the other hand, those who
which is
correctly
a causal.
perceive the essential as
The way
essential
the Buddha
and
put it
the
is
non-essential
slightly
as
different.
non-essential will and feet.
This
Mind is the
arises,
forerunner of all
that
actions.
becomes,
All deeds are led by mind,
because between
created
this
by
and that,
mind. If one
there is a
speaks or
polar
acts
relationship.
with a rest and unrest derive from illusion
And
with
the full
enlightenment. There is no
explanation
liking
of
and
karma in
disliking.
Buddhist
All
philosophy
dualities come from
is
ignorance.
called
To
pratikya
return to the
samutpada,
root is to find meaning,
which means
but to pursue appearances is to
the
miss the source.
interdependent
At the moment of
origination
inner enlightenment,
of all the
for the
forms and
great
phases
way
of
is
life.
not difficult for those who have no preferences. When
Pratikya
love and hate
samutpada.
are both absent, everything becomes
And there are 12 links, shall we say, in the chain of interdependent origination, constituting a circle. And the existence of the circle depends on the presence of every one of the links. From one point of view,
if I am without beginning, without end, older than night or day, younger than the babe newborn, brighter than light, darker than darkness, beyond all things and creatures, yet fixed in the heart of everyone. From me the shining worlds flow forth to me.
Of the vicious circle in which most people and beings are living,
That's where we start. I asked myself, what this literally came across when it's like you understand about the world.
the round of birth and death, the Pada chakra, the wheel of Dharma which is becoming. And so going round and round and round in the endless game of hide and seek is from one point of view bondage. Bondage to karma. And if you study the Bhagavad Gita, which is not a Buddhist book but a Hindu scripture, Krishna,
The meditation on hell, if I am without beginning.
Explains that the wise man is one who does what is called nishkama karma, nishkama, Nishkama, meaning passionless activity, in the sense that he acts without seeking a result, without being motivated by the fruits of action, and therefore is not bound by his own action. You can be bound to samsara, the wheel of birth and death, by iron chains or gold chains. The chains are, I'm talking in more or less the language of popular Hinduism, that if you do bad deeds in this life, you will get bad result next time. If you do good deeds in this life, you may be reborn as an angel or as a monk, in which you'll get a better chance of liberation. But still, so long as you're looking for results, be they good or evil, you're still bound. Now, the way in which one becomes, as it were, free of karma involves another Buddhist point of view, which is a kind of a different way of looking at the chain of interdependent origination. It's the way which the Japanese call jiji muge. That is to say, the mutual interpenetration of all things and events. So that you could say that actually, in fact, the deepest level of reality, this entire cosmos is a completely harmonious and blissful manifestation of everything in a state of total enlightenment and mutual compassion. And therefore the task of the Buddhist or the Hindu discipline